Now, most of the aquariums we're showing you have multiple species in them. They're multiple species community aquariums. But every now and then you come across a species of fish that is worth keeping by itself. It's worth dedicating an entire aquarium to them. This is one of those species. This is the cherry spot Tropheus from Bulu Point. Tropheus morii is the species name. And these are a highly specialized, really interesting cichlid from Lake Tanganyika. They're specialized to eat algae and biofilm. And the way they do that is they go down to the rocks and they scrape it off. They have these very specialized teeth. If you look at them under the microscope, it's like 3 or 4 different kinds of teeth on each kind of tricuspid tooth plate. All these little tips on there specialize in scraping all kinds of algae off of the rocks. And because that's their niche, eating algae, we have to be careful what they feed them. This is not a fish you can just feed any kind of fish food to. They need to be veggie-based foods. So we feed generally spirulina flake. We'll also feed algae wafers. You can feed some of the rapashi vegetable formulations, algae formulations. And then very occasionally, we will feed them frozen adult brine shrimp that we've previously thawed. Not often, but the reason that works is because brine shrimp has so much exoskeleton on it, so much keratin, that acts as fiber. And so that helps move everything through. So occasionally we do give them a little treat of frozen brine shrimp, but it's very occasional. Usually it's just veggie-based foods. Your aquarium foods that are algae-based, if you look at the ingredient list, most of them also have quite a bit of animal protein in them. So I would search for one that the first ingredient or two is spirulina or some kind of vegetable, and then later we get into the protein, because we don't want real high animal protein and fats for these guys. The other thing about feeding this fish is you don't want to feed it super heavy. We feed quite lightly. We feed every day, but very lightly. These fish never eat so much that they're like bulking out, that their bellies are stuffed. Because in nature, the rocks they're grazing on a lot. There's not a lot of food on them. So these guys have to go around all day long looking for tiny little morsels of algae to eat. They don't get big, massive feedings at a single time during the day. Instead, they're grazing all day long on bits of algae. They're going back to the same rock and hoping that a little bit more algae grew so they can get a little more off that one today, and then they have to go to the next rock. We feed veggie-based foods, and we also feed quite sparingly. So there's several good-sized fish in this tank. Let's go ahead and feed them, because that'll bring them out and make them fun. Also, when you feed, they fire up. You're gonna see here soon that the males are gonna fire up pretty bright. Nice bright reds are gonna start appearing. Now they always have the red, but at feeding time, boom, they flare up really bright to say, hey, I'm dominant, give me some food. They do that when they breed too, and by the way, they breed all the time. They're very prolific. In fact, the way they breed is fairly unique. In Lake Malawi, there's lots and lots of mouth brooders. In Lake Tanganyika, where these come from, there's less mouth brooders, but this is one of them. In fact, their genus, Tropheus, that comes from the Greek term for to nurse. So they were named that because of how they nurse and care for their young. The females lay very large eggs that develop into very large, well-developed babies, and they keep those in their mouths until they're free swimming, and then they keep them in their mouth, then they'll let them out to feed and then get them a little, when they need protection, they'll suck them back up in their mouth. And they do that for a while until those babies are so big and well-developed and adapted to life that they have a good chance of survival. So their strategy is to nurse Tropheus, their young, until they're highly competent and are likely to survive, versus what a lot of fish do, which is just spawn a ton of eggs and hope a few of them survive. So really, really good parental care on these. And there's an interesting study that was actually done on babies of these that were growing out. So we often hear in the cichlid hobby especially, these are a type of cichlid, that if the fish aren't fed a lot when they're young, that they'll get stunted, right? And once they're stunted, they won't reach their full potential. And that can be true of a lot of fish. That's been proven in a lot of fish. But there was a study done to see if it was true with this fish. And what they did is they spawned some fish and they fed them normally and raised them up for 3 months. And then at 3 months, they took half of those fish and they purposely stunted them. The other fish ate daily, 5 days a week. This batch only got 3 days a week of feeding, so it was purposely stunted. They did that for 20 weeks. And then after that, they started feeding them normally. And what they found was that although they did stay smaller because they got less food, they didn't grow as fast as the control group that was fed normally, that after they resumed normal feeding, their normal growth appeared again. They didn't like have this rapid growth spurt to make up for it or anything. They just started growing as if they would have if they had had normal food all along, and they just kept growing. And after a certain time, they caught up to and were just as likely to be dominant as and breed as the group that had been fully fed, the group that had not been stunted. So that's an interesting thing about Tropheus. Now, I'm not suggesting we stunt our fish. That's not the purpose of this. It's just an example of how unique and interesting this fish is compared to a lot of other cichlids. Because of its unique niche it's inhabited to eat pretty much algae and maybe some biofilms, some diatoms, stuff like that. So really interesting, these guys. So another interesting study that was done in the wild in Lake Tanganyika, down at the very, very southern tip at Mapalunga, I think is how you say it, harbor. What happened there is you have the natural population of Tropheus there, but you also have at least 4 other populations of Tropheus that have been introduced to that spot from other areas of the lake. So you're able to study how they breed in the wild. Do they randomly select a mate? Do they have a high preference for certain kinds of mates? The answer is they have a very high preference for their own color morph. So down there you have some olive type colorations on some of the populations. You have some intense red colorations on some of the other populations. And what they found was it was like 1.7% of red-based Tropheus bred with the olive-colored Tropheus in the wild. So their selections for the red colorations that this particular location has from Bulu Point, or the yellows that you get from Icola, or the olives that you can get, all these different color morphs come from preferences for that color. Now that might seem obvious, but it's interesting that there was a study done that proves it. They're not just randomly breeding with whomever. They're selecting fish that look like them, that have the same color as them. And it's that color that really makes the mating factor of, I'm going to choose you as a mate because you have the right color. Which makes sense. Why else would you develop these beautiful, bright reds in neat patterns? You're standing out more to predators. Why do that? Well, you're more likely to reproduce. So that's all. Just a few examples of how interesting this fish is. There's hundreds more. There's been so many scientific studies done on them. For aquarium keeping, you might notice they're the only species in this tank. And that's because they're pretty specialized. I don't want to keep them with other fish that need like a meat-based diet. I want to be able to feed these the veggies they need. And so that kind of curtails the other species I can keep them with. I don't want to feed high protein, high animal protein, high fat foods to these because they could bloat up and get sick and die. So they have kind of specialized diet. There are fish though that can go with them. Now, they're pretty aggressive. In fact, they're one of the most aggressive species from Lake Tanganyika. So you have to be really selective with what you keep them with, but you can keep them with like Ancestris plecos. You could keep them with really fast swimming fish, maybe giant danios or some kind of rainbow fish, a Chilotharina type rainbow fish that's really quick. Synodontis would go okay with them. And Synodontis are omnivore enough that they'd probably be okay on the veggie foods we feed these, because remember, there's still animal protein in most of those veggie foods. It's just not the primary thing that they're eating. So there are a few that you can keep them with, but honestly, I think this fish deserves a tank of its own. It takes a lot of worry out of the equation if it's just them in there. You don't have to worry about different diets and, ooh, are they gonna be aggressive and stuff? Even among themselves though, there can be aggression. So that's why they're kept in big groups, like a dozen to 20 individuals and like a 75-gallon tank is probably a good stocking number. They'll be happy in that size tank, and they are going to keep their aggression under control. I would never keep these in pairs or trios or something. You need a good sized group. But the good news is that if you do have big groups, they're generally fine. They get their hierarchy, everyone has enough room in the tank, and there's plenty of others around to pay attention to, that no one fish just gets all beat to hell, basically. So big groups of these is the key. Now, they do have a bit of a reputation as being difficult, but I have to tell you that has not been my experience. I've probably kept half a dozen or more different species and or locations and variants of the Tropheus from Lake Tanganyika. I find them to be bulletproof. Now, I do feed them a veggie-based diet, that helps. I'm also sourcing aquarium bred and raised fish, that helps. But I have not encountered the problems that are reported with Tropheus. I also have hard alkaline water here, that helps. Lake Tanganyika has very hard alkaline water, and we keep them at 79 degrees. All those factors together, they seem to do great for us. They breed for us, whether we want them to or not. We have babies appear and grow up, whether we try to or not. And we don't have deaths or anything. The only time we have trouble is if we don't have enough of them in a tank. If I sold these down to where there's only 4 left or something like that, I would need to separate them out to other tanks so that they don't just beat each other. So that's the thing to be aware of. Anyway, Cherry Spot Tropheus from Bulu Point, worth a tank of its own. Awesome fish. If you like going down the nature nerd rabbit hole, you'll read endless scientific research on Tropheus and just see how unique and awesome these fish are. They're one of a kind. There's just nothing quite like them. Nature, I don't know, what do they say? Nature threw out the mold, broke the mold after they made this one. That's kind of what they're like. If you want to know more about aquarium fish and fish keeping, we do a live stream every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern time. We'd love to see you there at the Dan's Fish YouTube channel. And if you see anything you like, we have a bunch of fish available for sale at dansfish.com. And you're more than welcome to order. That is how we make our living, so that's highly encouraged. Anyway, until next time, I hope you have a really good one. Bye-bye.